Okay, I think we're going to start. A very warm welcome to this URM webinar, where we'll be specifically focusing on the new requirements introduced by the release of version 4 of the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, PCI DSS. As many of you are aware, the version 4 was introduced at the end of March 2022. This webinar follows on from URM's April 22 webinar, where we provided a high-level overview of the standard. Just by way of introduction, my name is Martin Jones. I'm one of the directors at URM, which is a PCI QSA company, and I'm joined by Alistair Stewart. Alistair is one of URM's senior QSAs, and he'll be presenting this webinar. Alistair's been a QSA for over 10 years and has been involved in over 100 assessments of the standard. Our goal today is using Alistair's experience and also the experience of other QSAs is to provide a practical insight and interpretation into the new requirements. We're just going to look at the agenda for today. Before we look at the new requirements, we're going to start with a transition timetable where we're going to look at when we need to meet the different requirements. Following on from the transition timetable, we're going to be looking at the brand new requirements. And this is the main part of our webinar. We'll be honing in on some of the brand new requirements that have not featured in previous versions of the standard. And Alistair will provide insights into the objectives of those requirements and, most importantly, how best to meet those requirements. Following on from the release of version 4 of the standard, we've seen the release of the updated self-assessment questionnaires, the SAQs, and this will be the third strand to the webinar presentation today. Alistair will guide you through the key changes and which SAQs have had brand new requirements added to the different SAQs. We've got a Q&A session at the end, and so as with all URM webinars, you'll have the opportunity to ask any specific questions you may have around the new requirements being introduced by version 4 of the standard. Just submit your questions using the question pane, and Alistair will attempt to answer as many of these at the end of the webinar. Okay, if you're just looking at the transition timetable, I think the key things here that we're going to be focusing on is when do I need to start using version 4? When will 3.2.1 retire? And how long do I have to implement the new requirements? So without further ado, if I can hand over to Alistair.
Yes, thank you, Martin. Welcome back, everyone. This is we did talk about this briefly in our last webinar when we talked about the release, just after the release, and it's worth mentioning again here because it's valid to the new requirements. So obviously the standard was released in March this year, but the old standard 321 is still going to be valid for the next 2 years. So both standards will run in parallel with each other until March 2024, and during that time you can validate your compliance to either version. Either version is perfectly valid, both will be accepted. After March 2024, you'll then have to validate to the new version 4. Some of the new requirements that are in, especially the ones we're going to talk about today, are only best practice until March 2025. There are also some new requirements that are actually effective immediately, and we'll point them out as we go along. But a lot of the new requirements we're going to talk about today, they're only best practice. That doesn't mean you should wait until March 2025 to actually implement them. You want to implement them as soon as you can, but it does mean you've got time to solve the problems and sort out the issues with implementing the new requirements.
Okay, thanks for that, Alistair. With the new requirements, what we're looking to do in this section, which is, I'll say, the main section of the webinar, is to identify what we see as the headline requirements, and more importantly, how you go about implementing them. I think, Alistair, you'll be picking out some of the ones which we think will be maybe more challenging or may involve a particular expense. Alistair?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a whole bunch of new requirements. There's a whole bunch of changes that range from very, very minor to what could be quite significant. So just a sort of general recap of some of the generic changes that have happened across nearly all the requirements. The primary one that's gone into every single requirement is the last requirement that was in each of the high-level requirements 1 to 12 was always make sure you have policies and procedures for managing that requirement, and they're documented in use and known. That's been moved to the first requirement under the high-level requirements to make it more prominent, and they've also pulled out from that a new sub-requirement that says that the roles and responsibilities that those policies and